everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight and filling our space for tonight's event. We are so excited. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are thrilled to have Joseph Lee and Leslie Jamison with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Joseph's debut book, Nothing More of This Land. And a special thing about tonight, this event is co-sponsored by the American Indian Community House. I'm going to pass it off really quickly to Drew, who's going to tell you a bit about that organization. Thank you, Drew.
Great. Nananaha. Hello, my name is Drew Woodson. I'm a member of the Tomoka Band of Western Shoshone from Elko, Nevada, and I am the Youth and Education Coordinator for the American Indian Community House here in New York City. We are so thrilled to be here co-sponsoring this event that is celebrating and uplifting Joseph's incredible book. And I just want to say a few words about what the Community House is, for those of you who are unfamiliar or who do not know. So the Community House has been around since 1969. It is the longest running Native nonprofit organization in New York City. Our mission is to best serve the Native and Indigenous people of all 5 boroughs of New York City and tribal communities beyond. We've done this through a bunch of different ways, whether that's been through a food bank, a health clinic, a supporter for Spider Woman Theater, or a home for Native artists of every possible artistic expression. We have had scholarships for Native students visiting New York, and ultimately it is a home base that can welcome every single Native person who comes to New York City. We at the Community House represent the urban Native and Indigenous population that seeks community and cultural harmonies while they are away from home, as well as the Lenape, Shinnecock, and other tribes that have been in New York from time immemorial. All of us at the Community House are so incredibly thrilled to be hosting this event, and especially hosting the kickoff of this incredible book that isn't afraid to dig into what it means to be Native on every possible space of the United States, including spaces like Martha's Vineyard. So we are just so excited to be here, just helping support you in your wonderful book, and I'll pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you to the American Indian Community House for working with us on this event. Now, I promise I'm not going to be up here for much longer. I'm just going to read a few logistics for how tonight's event is going to go, some quick bios, and then we'll dive right in. So first up, we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion. So please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. Joseph pre-signed all the books, in fact, but if you want them personalized to a specific name, he will be around afterwards. Just personalize your books. So we'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And finally, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Nothing More of This Land online using the link in the live stream description. Okay, now for our guests. Joseph Lee is an Aquinnah Wampanoag writer based in New York City. He has an MFA from Columbia University and teaches creative writing at Mercy University. He was a Margins Fellow at the Asian American Writers Workshop and a Senior Indigenous Affairs Fellow at GRIST. He has won multiple awards from the Indigenous Journalists Association for environmental coverage, health coverage, and beat reporting. And this book was awarded a 2024 Silvers Grant for Work in Progress. As I mentioned earlier, Leslie Jamison joins Joseph in conversation tonight. Leslie is the author of the New York Times bestsellers Splinters, The Recovering and the Empathy Exams, the essay collection Make It Scream, Make It Burn, and the novel The Gin Closet. She writes regularly for The New Yorker, teaches at Columbia University, and lives here in Brooklyn. That's all for me. Please join me in giving Joseph and Leslie a very warm welcome.
I was just going to say it's such a thrill to be here. And this book, I know some of you have read it, but maybe some of you haven't had the chance yet. It's so good and it's so important. And when I was thinking about some of my first reactions to it, when I had the chance to read it early on, I just remember having this really strong, deep feeling that the world is just a bigger place full of more truth because this book is in it. And I can think of no greater thing a book can do. So we're just all lucky to be here in the room celebrating it coming into the world. And I feel lucky that I get to ask you some questions about it. And maybe we'll get to start by just hearing you read a little bit from it.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Leslie. And thank you, everybody else. I'm just going to read. And then we'll talk. All right. This is from the very beginning. According to Wampanoag legend, Martha's Vineyard wasn't always an island. In search of a new homeland for his people, the giant Moshup wandered the Massachusetts coastline. As he began to tire, Moshup's big toe dragged through the sand, leaving a deep trench. Cold seawater rushed in and eventually grew to become the Vineyard Sound. And so Moshup's weary foot inadvertently carved off a new home for the Wampanoag people, the island we call Nopi, a still place among the currents. Over the long years of his rule, Moshup shaped other features of Nopi. To feed his people, the giant waded out into the cold ocean water to snatch whales from the depths. Back on shore, Moshup killed the whales by slamming them against the clay cliffs at the western tip of the island. Their blood stained the clay its distinctive red color. The Wampanoag people called this place Aquina, the land under the hill or land at the end. Although their new life on Nopi was good, Moshup decided to build a bridge back to the mainland, so his people could trade with the mainlanders. While he tossed huge boulders into the sea, a giant crab snuck up and pinched his foot. Roaring in pain, the giant hurled the crab far out to sea, forming the small island we call Nomans. The bridge remained unfinished. To this day, the rocky area known as Devil's Bridge is treacherous for boats. After a long, peaceful life, Moshup foresaw the arrival of a new people who would change Wampanoag life forever. He offered to turn the Wampanoag into whales, and many accepted, preferring to live at sea rather than face the mysterious newcomers. Bidding farewell to those who remained, Moshup and his wife Squant walked into the southern dunes, never to be seen again. On foggy nights, Wampanoag say that Moshup is smoking his great pipe, still watching over us. Every summer, my tribe reenacts these stories, the legends of Moshup, for a paying audience of summer tourists. Those are some of my earliest memories of the tribe, my moccasin feet squelching through the mud, the embarrassment of wearing a breechcloth, the familiar smell of citronella candles, and the echo of my cousin Adriana's narration in the summer night. As the performance moved toward its inevitable conclusion and machine-made fog rolled in, I never wanted it to end, despite my mosquito bites and self-consciousness. Acting out the familiar scenes, I always imagined a different ending, a Nopi without the invaders Moshup foresaw. In those moments, after a summer spent immersed in tribal community and exploring the same lands the giant had shaped, it felt possible. I thought of him like a hero from my favorite cartoons, and I imagined new adventures he might have had. To me, Moshup wasn't an artifact from the past, but dynamic and alive. The real connection I felt to him, the land, and our ancestors made me believe that one day he might return, and when he did, the island would revert to the way it used to be. But once the performance was over, Moshup was gone again, the illusion was shattered, and we were all left to wonder if those he had turned into whales were better off. As I grew older, I spent less time imagining our tribal legends coming to life and more time dwelling on the sad finality of the story. I know now that Moshup is not coming back.
It's so wonderful to hear the book in your voice. And even those opening pages capture so much of what I love about the texture and range and vision of this book, which manages to hold simultaneously these large, difficult, often abstract questions about history, sovereignty, identity, community, and to ask and explore those questions on some of the largest possible scales and in ways that draw on your life and experience and work as a journalist, but that are always grounded also in lived experience and in the kind of the texture that we heard even in your words just then, the mosquito bites and the citronella candles and the, you know, those minor discomforts that live alongside also this engagement with deep history, and that kind of that holding of multiple scales of experience feels like one of the things that's most singular and unforgettable about this project. And so I wonder, as a kind of way into the book, especially for those of us and the people in the room who haven't yet read it, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, kind of give us the lay of the land of the book, but maybe particularly thinking about how those scales are working together, how your own experience, your family's experience, your exploration of your own tribal history is sort of working with and alongside this journalistic exploration that's also larger in scope.
Yeah, I should also say that when I went to grad school, Leslie was my first teacher, and then I took like 4 more classes with her, and so I feel a little bit like I'm like in the classroom, trying to like, did I do the homework? And it turns out this time I wrote the book. So
you've done the homework.
Yeah. I was trying to read it today, like what's in here, you know? But yeah, I think this is like the core question of the book, and I think the reason I wanted to work on so many of those different levels and layers is because I think often when we talk about Native stories or when we tell Indigenous history, it's only from like one angle, right? Often it's this perspective of loss or tragedy, or it's like this very narrow glimpse of hope, like this tribe started a community garden, like let's talk about that. But to really talk about it, you have to talk about all of these things. And I think that's what I wanted to do. And also I felt it was the thing that I could offer, right? I'm not a scientist, I'm not a trained historian, I'm not any of those things, but I'm just a person, like to your point, that I can ask a lot of questions, and I can go around and ask other people questions and bring some of that back. And so I think that's what I was trying to do here, is like create a space for that kind of complexity and nuance, rather than like, here's this one straightforward kind of way of talking about this thing.
Yeah, and I appreciate so much that the complexities of this book are kind of manifold and present in every moment, but never oppressively so. Like it always feels like your need to bring in how a situation can be many things at once. Like a history can be full of suffering, full also of joy, pleasure, interest, vitality, like that none of these things diminish the other. And really the only way to do justice to that simultaneity, I think, is to write with specificity and rigor and knowledge. And you do that on every page of this book. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit, I love that idea of having these driving questions and bringing those questions to your own experience and then also out into the world and kind of bringing back what you found. And I wonder if you could sort of enumerate some of what feel like the core questions of this book.
Yeah, I think probably like any self-respecting author, it's just a very selfish pursuit, that it was like, here's what I want to know, and here's what I want to know about myself. So I had all these questions growing up, like, what does it mean to be Native? What does it mean to be Wampanoag? How do we make sense of all these things? And that's where it started, was like trying to understand what it means to be specifically Wampanoag, but more broadly Indigenous, and then being from a place like Martha's Vineyard and trying to understand all of that, and then not living on Martha's Vineyard, and then like seeing my community and my tribe dealing with these questions. That's kind of where originally I was like, there's something here that I think is worth talking about, that I'm personally interested in. And then the more I go around and talk to other people, then it's like, oh, other people are asking these questions too. And I think collectively we're like trying to find a way through, and hopefully I did some of that.
Well, and there is this beautiful way that structurally the book accomplishes and enacts a feeling of accompaniment, right? Because we start, it's not quite this simple, but we start primarily grounded in your experience in the kind of Wampanoag history and some of the kind of struggles and internal divisions and histories that you enumerate there. And then the book, broadly speaking, sort of follows a lot of your journalistic pursuits. But along the way, it feels like kind of like more and more stories and more figures and more people are being brought into the circle of the book. And so by the end, there is this profound feeling of accompaniment because all of these other voices have become part of the text. And I actually love that, as so often we think of plot trajectories or even trajectories of narrative nonfiction in sort of limited ways. Like, what can a trajectory be? But I think kind of bringing more and more voices in and kind of creating community just through all of those conversations is a trajectory that I hadn't quite thought of before. And I love the way you talk about the kind of selfishness of bringing those questions from your own youth, because I think Joseph has gotten to hear me say some versions of sentiment so many times in multiple classes. But one of my favorite observations about nonfiction writing came from my own mentor, Charlie D'Ambrosio, who said this thing to me once. He said, the problem with an essay can become its subject, and that way that so often a thing that feels like an obstacle in the intellectual pursuit actually becomes the grist, it becomes the occasion, it becomes the question. And I see over and over and again the way this book is animated by, well, am I still Native if I don't live on the island? Or am I still Native if I'm not on a reservation? Or am I, all those questions that feel like stumbling blocks or something become, in fact, not only these great engines of inquiry, but also these kind of like profound moral offerings and necessary reckonings. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you, how the process of writing about your own experience in your own life, which is not all of this book, but is some of this book, kind of what you found that you didn't already, what you found out that you didn't already know. You know, what were some of the revelations or surprises or kind of uncoverings there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one part of the answer to that question is I wanted to do that because I needed, I think to a certain extent, to like catch people up to like bring people along to where I was now asking these questions, and like, why am I asking these questions? And hopefully describe it in a way that is kind of like, here's how maybe you relate to these questions, and these questions are hopefully at least partially universal. And I mean, I think that what I was really trying to do is like build this sort of narrative flow that it was starting with myself, but hopefully not ending with myself. And this question, this thing about, you know, where an essay comes from is, or what an essay can do, and what sort of the meat the essay is working with, or what creative nonfiction writing is working with. And I think I was trying to like give myself as much stuff to work with. And doing that, I think what I realized is that I had to sort of do this broadening rather than like deepening. And I think going back to earlier when we were talking about like the way that Native history is often told, is that it's often like we haven't told all these stories, right? So if we're going to talk about this, we have to tell the full story. We have to go deeper in, because all these stories have been overlooked, ignored, all these things. And I think that that's one approach, but I also think that in doing that, we lose so much of that broader view and like collecting all of the grist, right? Collecting all of those things that we can then bring in. And I think that's kind of what I was trying to do in that respect.
Yeah, and there's, I love that way you talk about texturally, even just like wanting to have as much stuff as you possibly could, and as much
all the stuff.
Yeah, all the stuff and all the, because I think sometimes sometimes I have an experience as a reader of encountering a book where I'm completely compelled by its questions, but I don't always know what ground I'm standing on as those questions are being asked. And not every book needs to work the same way or have the same kind of ground or provide the same feeling of groundedness. But in this book, I felt like one of its great gifts was that there is a lot of tangible world in this book, but it's like many worlds. It's not just one. And in each one of those worlds, you're very alive to and kind of bringing back to us, your readers, a kind of, a lot of sensory information, a lot of kind of specificity in like, what did somebody's company feel like? What did it feel like to like chew through difficult questions with this person? What did it feel like to like sit in a room with this person as the sun went down? Like, how was the question of sovereignty differently complicated for this tribe than this one? Like you give yourself a lot of the material of living to kind of keep us feeling like we're touching the real all the time, even as you are bringing in these like, really dense and rigorous questions and not shying away from their rigor. And I think there's a moment very early on, even in just what you read, that made me think about something this book was doing so well, which is this moment where you're moving from the myth to your own performance of the myth, where you say, every summer my tribe reenacts these stories, the legends of Moshe. And then you kind of bring us into your body, the embarrassment of wearing a breechcloth, the familiar smell of citronella candles. And part of what happens there is that you're sort of asking, again, without being didactic about it, you're sort of asking us to relocate from like maybe one of the familiar registers in which the Native experience is often described, the register of myth,
Right.
to like, no, here's a body in a place performing for tourists. Like this is part of the Native story and my Native story, and you're also kind of deftly bringing into the frame these questions of like identity is something inherited and it's also something performed, and it's a struggle. It's not a status quo, and so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about identity as a kind of motivating question in this book, but really bring us into the complicated way you're thinking about it. It is a lineage, but it's also you performing for paying tourists, and that doesn't de-authenticate it. It is part of it. It's sort of like how do performance and identity and both in your own experience and in your investigation sort of how did you come to think about those things differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think that example that you read, that's part of that is just that's how my brain works, sometimes for good and sometimes unfortunately, that like I can't finish the thought before I'm like, well, what about that? Or like, well, it's a little more complicated. And so I think the whole book was me trying to just like wrangle that and like make it make sense. But I also think what I wanted to do was tell a story that was very much like owning my perspective and my experience, because I really didn't want to write a book. And I know that just inevitably when you're writing from a perspective that, hasn't been heard as much as it should, it can happen that people are like, this person is speaking for this group, right? And I really wanted to do everything I could to avoid that kind of labeling. So I wanted to just own who I was, where I was coming from as much as possible, and like acknowledge all the different, experiences or privileges or, weirdnesses that I've had along the way. And I think for me, that was the only way that I could then get into the other things rather than coming to it sort of like blank. I needed to come to it like fully, like I'm coming with this, and here's why I want to know this, and here's why I'm going to ask you this. And I think it just had to be that way. And then the bigger question of identity is just, I think Native identity, Indigenous identity is one of those things that is just like talked about a lot, but I think not understood very well. And to your previous question, that's why I wanted to get as much stuff as possible, because it's talked about in these narrow ways. But I think there's so much more to it. And I think for some reason, we just don't allow that kind of complexity. And so I wanted to start with like my own sort of complexity and then use that as a way to arrive at like, well, here's what other people are doing and thinking.
Oh my God. 16 more questions. Our brains combined are just like, oh, let's go down that hallway and that hallway and that hallway. And I can
in workshop, Leslie had a timer for this reason that would like this like jarring alarm that it's like, it's over. You got to stop talking.
I know. And a beloved or perhaps not beloved ritual of workshop was the alarm going and then the conversation just continuing. But yeah, I can remember well even you're always insightful and often game-changing contributions to our class conversations, but there was like a particular look in your eyes that you would get, and I knew what was coming was like Joseph was gonna be like, I think it's a little more complicated than that, and then it would be like, all right, here we
It's a classic Joseph comment.
no room for both. We're gonna get past the easiest way of saying this and actually get into it, but it was so valuable then, and it is so valuable in these pages. And I mean, there's so much that I want to follow up on, but one thing that I was thinking about as you were talking, and especially sort of talking about wanting to own where you were coming from and the particular, the life that had led you to these questions, I found it so valuable on many levels that you bring us into in some ways, like the logistics of your relationship to Martha's Vineyard as a place. Like, until the age of 8, I, went for 2 months during the summer. And then, I went, I started to go more when my parents took over running my grandparents' gift shop. And, that you, through those, like here precisely is what it looked like for me to be moving between Newton, where you're growing up, and the island. You actually bring us directly into some of the biggest questions of the book, which is like, you know, in some basic way, when land is stolen, like how do people then relate to that land for hundreds of years to come? And so it's in that way, it felt like, oh, the specifics of how you were both inside of and sometimes felt yourself to be not completely inside of this world, like that, these are exactly the truths that need to be kind of part of the story rather than caveats or asterisks or anything like that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the gift shop, since it came up here, as there's a chapter here that's sort of more or less devoted to the gift shop, but you use that space, I think, to dig into so many of the questions at the core of this book in a really interesting way. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about it, and also, you know, the question of craft for the nonfiction writer is not just like, what did I live, but how did I use what I lived? So I wonder how you thought about using that space and that set of experiences to sort of open up certain inquiries here.
Yeah, so the gift shop, my mom's here in the front. You can find her after. So the gift shop was started by my grandparents on Martha's Vineyard. And then, as you said, when I was young, my parents took it over. And from a young age, my brother, who's also here, we were working in the store and like learning how to, you know, you're like growing up and you're a little bit taller than the counter, and then you're like much taller than the counter, and like people take you not seriously and like a little bit serious. And, you know, so we're learning how to fold t-shirts and like talk to customers and sell things, and in some cases sell yourself a little bit, because people come and they want a story. It's not like, I don't know, walking into like a Walgreens or you're just trying to buy something. People want this experience. And I think what I realized mostly in writing the book was how much those experiences had informed the way I was thinking about Native identity as this thing that, yeah, it can be performed, and is also this thing that comes with all these expectations. Because, you know, anybody who's worked in retail knows that just people are like unhinged, and like they will just come in, you have not said anything, and they're like, let me talk to this guy. And especially in a situation like that, Martha's Vineyard, it's kind of this unique place, and then knowing that there's like a tribe there, and then they meet you and it's like you're an Indian, and then like it's this whole thing, and people just say anything, like absolutely anything. And I think like that was hard, because it was hard to think of like identity as something outside of that, because I was spending so much time at the store and thinking about it in that way, that it had to be this thing that like I need another way to think about it. Like I need to not be thinking about it in this customer way. Right. But on the other hand, I don't want to leave that behind, because that's such an important part of my personal story. And then through reporting and talking to other people, it like tourism and this aspect of Native identity that's performed, that's such an important part to everybody. And I also just want to, the point you're making about like the logistical aspect, I think that's something that is a gift that I got from doing journalism, is that you have these big questions about like, what is sovereignty? What is identity? Who am, you know? And in reporting, it's like, that doesn't matter. Like you can't do that. It's like, how much is your bill? Like, what's the problem? Like, why is your road broken? And, you know, like, why are these things happening? And then eventually you can get back to those bigger questions. But if you start with that, you know, if you're going reporting and you're like, what is sovereignty? It's like, it's not really. Right. Although I did ask that to several people in reporting this book. And then like an hour later, I'm like, I should have asked a better question. Yeah.
Yes, one of my questions in here.
Yeah,
what is sovereignty?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I love what you just said about just like on a like a craft process nerd level, like anybody who has done journalism or wants to do journalism should just be like feverishly writing down what Joseph just said about questions, because I feel like I learned very much the hard way, and probably still need to keep learning, like that one doesn't come in with just like, what is sovereignty, or like kind of like, let me like nervously tell you all the things that I like read on the plane preparing for this interview, or something, you know, actually coming in and being like, here are some really specific questions about what's going on. And then it's like, all right, then you're like in it with somebody, you're in experience and shared reality, and honestly asking about what you don't know. And it's always the way in. So wise. And I guess I on that note, what is sovereignty?
Yeah.
No, but I really am. I mean, I was interested, when I talk about these kind of rigorous, big picture, deep reaching, necessary questions, but that you're always grounding in the particulars of history and lived experience and particular people. I was curious to hear you talk a little bit about your evolving understanding of like the many dimensions of sovereignty, and maybe particularly what some of the, like there's a moment, I think, when you're talking about an early conversation you had with Matthew Fletcher, where you're sort of like, I sat up in my chair and realized
I asked him the question.
well, you got some pretty interesting
Yeah,
responses, I have to say. So it might not have been the worst question
Yeah,
in that
yeah.
case, but some of the moments where you sort of felt you sat up in your chair and realized you kind of were being invited to think about sovereignty in a pretty different way than you've been thinking about it before. If you could maybe take us through some of those juncture moments or turning point moments.
Yeah, so I was born like just a few years after my tribe got federal recognition, which is kind of like the US version of sovereignty. And I think growing up with that, I was growing up in a time where in the community, it was like, we did it, right? Like we achieved this thing, we got federal recognition, we're getting resources, we're getting funding, we're like acknowledged, we're legit, this is great. And it was great. But I think that sort of limited the way I was thinking about it, that I only saw it as like this very simple, like the US government said, like, these guys are legit, like it's great, we're good to go. Obviously, it's more complicated than that. And what I was trying to do with people like Matthew Fletcher and through my reporting is lean into those complexities and really understand, like, well, what is sovereignty, and are there different kinds of sovereignty? And if we're only talking about this sort of like institutionalized US government federal recognition sovereignty, what are we missing?
Mm-hmm.
Or what are other ways? Or what are the ways in which tribes could use that sovereignty to do something that's a little bit subversive? And so some of the tribes I talked to are doing that, which was really interesting to me, coming from a small tribe, which I think in many ways is just resource and people limited. And so you go to bigger tribes and it's like there's just sort of more stuff, more disagreement, more resources, more things. And that was really interesting to me in trying to understand this question of like, what does it mean to be sovereign? And I think it was like growing up, it was like there's the bad racist like stereotypes about Native people. Sovereignty is kind of like the good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like we want to have the sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as always with like a binary, it's
Right.
really not that simple. And so that's what I was sort of trying to unpack.
Right. And yeah, it's almost the flip side of like trying to also sort of push against the way you were describing earlier, the gift shop as a sort of site when like you wanted so much to come to a sense of identity that wasn't just that, or wasn't this like version of yourself reflected in the eyes of these unhinged customers. And I will say that's both a riveting chapter and also a chapter where I kept being like, no, like, oh, like I'm white and I hate white people,
Yeah.
like I was, just
Mission accomplished.
Well done.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's like a, you're just, and again, I think, you've heard me say the word specificity, 100 million times, but I think it does very good work there and elsewhere. But again, it's sort of like to take, okay, I know identity is not that. What can it be? It's almost like the flip side of that is to take the good of sovereignty and say, well, okay, what's lurking kind of behind this thing that had been the cherished holy grail, or the thing we're chasing after. There's a one of the moments that I love most in the myth that you read at the opening is the idea, the kind of presence of exhaustion in the myth. As he began to tire, Moshep's big toe dragged through the sand, leaving a deep trench, which becomes Vineyard Sound. And it made me think, as I was rereading this book and listening to you read it after having kind of read all of it and then been starting to summon my questions for you today, I was reading that line in a different way, where I was thinking there's not only something beautiful about the idea that a world is formed also by moments of exhaustion, the big toe dragged in the sand, but it also in a way, in a nicely subtle way, opens up the ways that I think your book is also willing to make room for and find ways of narrating exhaustion, frustration, stalemate, division, tension, all of these things, both lived by individuals and experienced by communities. And that feels to me like part and parcel of the way your mind works, in terms of like not wanting to just present the sort of smoothly photoshopped version of a thing, but like, no, let's get into the grit. Let's get into the moments of disagreement. Let's get into the moments where it felt hard to move forward, or where it was tiring, or where there was, it was dispiriting, and I wonder, my next question is about joy and pleasure, so don't worry, we're not going to get lost in the mires of this for good, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of what kind of room you wanted to make for those kind of states and presences on all sorts of levels.
Yeah, this was I guess, constant battle in writing it. Like, how angry should the book be, or how frustrated should the book be? And I think, looking at it now, I feel that there's probably some frustration, but I don't think it's like an angry book or a frustrated book. And I think I wanted to write it that way because I think a lot of those moments, like in the store, people saying like these wild things, like I don't think I need to say like that was insane, I think it's clear, but I think that I didn't want to like indulge in it to a certain extent. And I think that's not to say that anger about these things, like these really like racism, colonialism, like it's real, and I think we should embrace it and talk about it. But just what I wanted to do, I think, was just a little bit different. And so I tried to make space for that, but not sort of let it consume the book. And I think what you pointed out in the Mashup story too is something that I really like about that story, that it's like, we think about these native myths and native land and native heritage, and the stereotype is like, it's this beautiful, like, the flute is playing, the butterflies are like there, you're talking to a squirrel, and like it's this deep, like beautiful, like joyful thing. Actually, if you listen to most like tribal creation stories or like myths, these things, like usually there's some pretty weird stuff that happened. Like Mashup made the island, there was basically an accident, he was tired, and then it's like, well, we live here, like this is this is pretty good. And so a lot of stories have that, and I think like we have to, and that's not to say he was there like really upset about it, they make it work.
Right.
And I think that's a lot of what the book is trying to do, is like, how can we make it work, right? And so it's like, we can be a little bit annoyed, we can be a little bit frustrated, but like, what are we, like, here's what we got, what are we gonna do?
Yeah, I love thinking about the sort of temporality of some of those affective states too. Like, it's there, and then what happens next, and what do we do with it, and maybe connect it in a way to like problem becoming subject. Like, okay, this problem is our subject. Like, what do we do next? And I, as promised, my kind of corollary question, because as I was writing that question, I think I was having a version of the feeling or desire or impulse that you were just describing, to not kind of co-sign on those reductive ways that so often, the Native story writ large is for often well-intentioned ways from certain people, is told so much in terms of suffering, annihilation, disappearance, genocide. And it's not that all of those things aren't true, because they are, but it's like, what are all the other things that are true alongside that? And the kind of craft question that emerges from my desire not to play into the very thing I was, so grateful to you for saving me from, was that I wanted to ask about the role of kind of pleasure, companionship, even moments of joy, how that plays into both your writing about your personal experience, but then also very memorably for me, there's a lot of writing in the reported material here about forms of pleasure and curiosity, like whether it's experiences of like communion over food or appreciation of very different natural landscapes. But it feels very intentional to me without being heavy-handed. That's like, yeah, pleasure is a big part of this story too. And so I wonder if you could talk about kind of how you thought about the role of pleasure in this book, how you kind of looked out for it, whether it was how conscious it was or how much it was sort of noticing it, where it glinted in the light.
Yeah, I mean, talking to other people, I always say, was the best part of the book. It's like I could talk to myself and stay, on the laptop forever, but going out and meeting people and talking to people and learning about them and where they come from, that was really the best part. I think anybody who's ever done this kind of thing is like, people don't want to talk about bad stuff. They talk about bad stuff because they have to, right? And in reporting on Indigenous communities, it's like people are calling attention to these issues because they have to, because it's a threat to them, their families, their land. And so they want me as a journalist to come and help them, get some attention on it and hopefully solve it. But what they really want to talk about is like, look at this cool place that I live, or like, have you tried this food?
Yeah.
And I think the more time you spend with people, the more you're able to get into that. And like, that's the real thing. And so I think it's like, we have to spend all this time talking about the bad stuff, these problems, that it prevents us from getting to the good stuff. And so I wanted to make sure that I was at least in part getting to the good stuff. And it's a balance, right? Like the craft point of view is like, you can't ignore the bad stuff because everybody does that all the time. And that's why there's so much bad stuff. But you have to make space for these things, especially because if you're, I think, doing your job, like you're listening to people and that's what they want to share. So you're not just there like collecting the bad story, you're there listening to what they want to actually share with you. And I think the sort of reframing that I learned is, it's not like we're trying to stop this thing, we're trying to protect this thing, right? And so then, okay, so what are you trying to protect? And then you get to talk about all of those things rather than just like the sort of external evil force, right?
Yeah, a way of framing the questions so that the aspects of experience you're drawing out aren't entirely reactive or defensive, but also like what's the wellspring? Like again, if anybody who wants to do journalism, just like write it all down, like that intuition for what is somebody really, and when does somebody's voice get excited and alive, and how can I keep following that tone? I have many questions scribbled down, and I could gladly just keep you in this chair for hours and ask you all of them, but I know that so many people in this room, now full of those standing in the back, have questions as well. So maybe we'll open it up to the room, and it's just just hands, and I'll probably say the questions back, hopefully somewhat accurately, so that everybody can hear.
Hi. So I grew up on Nantucket. I'm very grateful for this book, especially because there aren't a lot of Wampanoag people on Nantucket. So I'm excited to learn from Sister Island. I was wondering, you talked about the kind of like stereotype mythology you contended with about Native people, but I'm wondering if you felt like you had to contend with the mythology and stereotype of Martha's Vineyard and what people think about when they think about the particular class dynamics there, or the stereotypes of, the wealthy person who vacations on the vineyard, and how that the Native identity is nested within those class struggles on the island.
Yeah, a question about reckoning not only with the stereotypes of Native identity, but the stereotypes of kind of Martha's Vineyard, the Martha's Vineyard of it all, a place that carries so much baggage, and also how the kind of Wampanoag experience is nested inside some of the class tensions.
Yeah, thank you. 100% yes. I think anytime you're talking about Martha's Vineyard, people have this idea of it. And then even just, you probably know this coming from Nantucket, that it's like people don't imagine anyone living there. It's just like celebrities and presidents and mansions. And so if they're like, real people live there, it's like, I don't know. And then like, and there's a tribe there, and I'm from that tribe. So there are all these layers. And even with the book, sometimes I find that a little bit challenging. Like I have to explain like, well, do you know Martha's Vineyard? And then have you heard of the Wampanoag people? And then there's all this other stuff. There are all these things like you have to work through to explain it. And that's definitely what happened in the part that we talked about with the store, is like you're always having to sort of fight through those expectations. And I think in some ways, I always thought being Wampanoag from Martha's Vineyard was like this unique Indigenous experience that wasn't like other Indigenous experiences. But one of the things I write about in the book is like I went to all these other places that, tribes on land that I think a lot of people would be like, it's not really that great there. Still, like white people are there, like, we're gonna steal that land. And so it's like, it doesn't matter if it's Martha's Vineyard or in the book, like literally toxic underwater land, that they're still like, that's ours. And so I thought it was kind of this unique thing, but it turns out that it's the same story everywhere. There are just some sort of unique details. And so I think that's true of non-Indigenous communities too. And so yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to do, and where I think like coming from Martha's Vineyard helped me ask those questions. But hopefully the place where I arrive is like beyond Martha's Vineyard, right?
And I will say though, this is definitely not just the Martha's Vineyard of celebrity, but there is an incredible story about Jackie Onassis that's part of this book that I would encourage everybody to read the book just for.
Thank you for writing this book. I really enjoyed writing it. I'm reading it, sorry. Reading it, I learned so much from it, and I was particularly fascinated with just the really mixed nature of background of your family. I mean, going back many generations. Then also thinking about a lot of the people that you interviewed who were also Indigenous but also mixed. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that aspect of your identity and Native identity and how that factored into the kind of question of like, what does it mean to be Native, and like, can you ever be Native enough, right? Like living up to those, whatever, the stereotypes or the other ways in which, you know, people might judge you. But yeah, I'd love to hear you speak about that.
Oh, are you gonna?
You can.
The question is about mixed identity and mixed family background and being Native enough or not Native enough. And thank you for this question. Yeah, I mean, the stuff at the store is where a lot of that comes from, because people are looking at me like, I don't think that guy is, you know, like that, no. And that's the way I've lived my whole life, is that people have such a very specific expectation of what Native people look like, and I don't really look like that, and so you're always having to like deal with that. And I think that a lot of people from different backgrounds and different identities can relate to that. And one of the things in writing the book is that I wanted to talk about my whole self, my whole family background, not just one part of it. And I think that's what we are often forced to do in Indigenous spaces, is like you have to talk about it only in this way, only about, like, if you had one Native grandparent, like only talk about that one. And then everyone else is kind of like, that's something else. And obviously that's not true. And Native communities are made up of people from all sorts of backgrounds. And I think this is something that like we just have to talk about. And so what I wanted to do in the book, or what I think the book allowed me to do for myself, is like to embrace all of those different parts of myself and to see all of those parts as not just like, okay, it's my cohesive self, but also like my Asian background is also part of the way I think about being Indigenous, because that's all part of the way I'm moving through the world. And yeah.
I really love the myth that you open the book with, that story of Masha. I'm really fascinated especially by the section where there's an option to become a whale and sort of leave this complexity behind. And I'm curious whether you've ever in the story kind of lingered in that moment and imagined and considered that choice of like, you know, becoming a whale and leaving behind this complex, the mixed identities, everything you're talking about, or just sort of where you linger in that story, in that part of the story.
If you want to.
Yeah, the question was kind of departing from the myth that happens at that's shared at the beginning of the book, and particularly kind of about whether Joseph has lingered in the moment in the myth when Moshe is kind of deciding whether or not to become a whale and kind of leave all of these complexities behind, and yeah, sort of what you find in that moment, and maybe how it connects to some of these, the kind of the work of living in complexities, or maybe the impulse to turn from them.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I thought about that story is like this question of staying on the land and leaving the land. And we've talked a little bit about this, is like, do you have to live on the Indigenous land to be Indigenous? And what does that mean? And if you leave, are you like giving up your indigenous identity? Are you leaving behind a piece of yourself? Are you like taking on a new challenge? Like, what is that? And I think for us in my tribe, such a small percentage of us still live there, that it's this question that we're really grappling with. And then I personally, I live here in New York, and so it's like, what does that mean? And how do I connect with the tribe? And it relates to the last question too, like, am I less Native because of that? And so that's really the way that I've thought about that story, is like, who made the more like Wampanoag choice there? Like the ones who left as whales, they were so saddened or distraught at the prospect of these new people coming and changing their way of life, that they're like, I can't even see it that way, so I'm going to leave and like become one with the land, essentially. Or the people who stayed and are like, I'm not leaving no matter what. And I always felt like I don't really live up to either of those. And so it's like, how, like, do I need to pick one and like try to do it? Or maybe there's another way? And hopefully the answer is that there's another way. And hopefully that's what I'm trying to do.
I was wondering if you could talk a bit about sort of this is a project that's journalistic and reported, but I haven't read it yet, but it sounds like you're obviously a piece of it. And can you talk about just that decision to include yourself and what that was like as someone who is a reporter and a journalist, but like then, yeah, just a bit. Sometimes I feel like those things can mean so much intention, like having that eye and having a piece of reported work.
Yeah, so the question was about the role of the I in this book, and specifically about the kind of decision and process of putting together a book that had so much journalistic material and also so much personal narrative. And yes, absolutely, like modes of writing and thinking and expression that are often understood, kind of there can be a tension between them for all kinds of reasons. So yeah, what that process was like to think about the role of the I and how those modes might work together.
Yeah, it's a good question and one I've thought a lot about. I'll say that I started with the I. It was, in Leslie's class, like wrestling with these things and trying to figure out stuff and how to write these essays. And I only later started doing journalism and added on all these other things. And I think just one of the reasons was because I started with these questions I had and this story that I wanted to tell and these things I was curious about. But I realized that the way I wanted to answer those was not just like me going deeper into my story, but I think I've said a few times, is like this broadening and talk to other people and bring their stories back in. And so that's really what I wanted to do. But then once I arrived at that sort of journalistic point, I didn't feel that I could leave behind the personal aspect, because that was very much like a part of those questions. And I also just think that it's a little bit less common. I think it's nice to hear those kind of stories where people are like owning kind of like, well, here's why I asked this question. And I always enjoyed reading that, like the kind of like how the sausage is made a little bit. And so I wanted to do that. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. Everybody buy this beautiful book. And
thank you.
Thank you everyone so much for coming out tonight. Thank you to all of you who asked such great questions. Thank you to Leslie for moderating such a fantastic conversation. And thank you to Joseph for celebrating this launch with us. And thank you to the American Indian Community House for co-sponsoring the event. Such a fantastic night. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. So before we all wrap up and head home, just a few quick reminders. If you're still with us on the live stream, you can buy a copy by clicking the link in the live stream description. For those of you with us in person, we have plenty of additional copies available for purchase at the register where you checked in. We also have copies of Leslie's most recent book, Splinters, 2 fantastic works of nonfiction, so I highly recommend checking them both out. Joseph has pre-signed all the books very graciously, so if you don't want to stick around to get your book personalized, we ask that you please do head outside so that we have some space to move around and rearrange the store. If you do want your book personalized, we're going to have you all line up down the center aisle and curve around to where my coworker Ariana is now waving. Thank you, Ariana. That's where Joseph will be hanging out to personalize your books. We ask that you please grab all of your personal belongings with you so that we can start to break down and rearrange the space. Thank you all again so much. Let's give these two one last round of applause.